From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam, and this is Democracy Works. Michael, who do we have on the show today?
Chris, today we have Charlie Dent, who, name that might be familiar, especially to people in Pennsylvania, was a congressman representing the 15th District in Pennsylvania as a Republican for 14 years until he left Congress after the 2018 election.
And he was here on campus because he's a proud alum. And
he won an award.
And so we took advantage of his time here to ask him to come on the show.
And I'm glad we did. He's in an interesting position, an interesting guy to talk with.
Very, very smart and very well, he knows Washington.
Really interesting opportunity for us to talk with him about democracy and Congress's role as we're in this really sort of interesting time in terms of congressional executive relations.
Right. Just in terms of, again, our focus is on democracy, and Charlie Dent has a very interesting and informed perspective on checks and balances. Right?
Yeah, and we really wanted to talk to him about that because the Mueller report is out. Mm-hmm. Democrats control the House. They've issued a range of subpoenas to members of the administration to solicit materials from the administration, and they're getting absolutely nowhere.
Right. So the question is, what is the proper role of the legislative and executive branch? How do they compete with each other, and who ultimately decides, right, when they conflict?
Right. It might be a good opportunity for us to just sort of review the idea of separation of powers and how
it is a distinctively American.
It really
notion.
is. It is very different from a parliamentary system, where, for example, the prime minister would come out of the legislative branch, and in fact continues to be a member of the legislative branch. But in the American system, as laid out very clearly and eloquently in Federalist 51 by James Madison, we've set up this system of separated powers.
Right. I think Madison says that each power should look after its own interests.
Right. He's got a great phrase called ambition counteracts ambition. And the idea was that each branch of government was to be given sufficient powers that it would attract ambitious people. They thought ambitious politicians were a good thing, not a bad thing.
And an inevitable thing.
And an inevitable thing. And that it would have sufficient power to make it a satisfying place to be, and sufficient power to be able to check the other branches of government.
The other thing, if I'm right, is that 51 says that the legislative branch in a republic has to be the most important, has to predominate, right?
Absolutely. And that's why in the Constitution it has the pride of place of being Article 1.
Article 1.
And in fact, most of the lawmaking powers are given to the Congress in Article 1. The Congress shall have the power to.
Right.
And then it lists most of the central powers as residing in the legislative branch. And because they recognize that the legislative branch would be so powerful, they divided it into two.
Right. And you could argue that, the American history may be certainly from Roosevelt on, but even before that, has been the expansion of the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislative branch.
Right, really up until Roosevelt, maybe the progressive era, but really up through the New Deal. And Roosevelt, the Congress really was the dominant branch of government. And, one of the most famous textbooks of the time written by Woodrow Wilson, who was a political scientist, was called Congressional Government. And it was, this idea that Congress is the primary branch of government, and the executive's job is to execute the laws that the Congress passes.
Right. And so the argument now is that what we have in terms of the operative sense of power in both branches is something that is different from, and maybe even antithetical to, what Madison and the founders laid out.
So we've been, we're talking about this today from sort of 10,000 feet.
Right, and from going on back 50, 70 years. Right?
Yeah, but the congressman is in a unique position to be able to talk about what it was like to be there for 14 years within the leadership, as a committee chairman, as the head of the co-head of a director of a caucus, and get his perspective.
And as a person who in himself represents this kind of old model of,
Yeah.
of the struggle between the parties as opposed to being, lockstep in one or the other.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, so look forward to this. Jenna, take it away.
This is Jenna Spinelli here today with Charlie Dent. Charlie, thanks for joining us on Democracy Works.
Hey, thanks, Jenna. Thanks for having me on the program.
So we're going to talk today about congressional oversight, the state of the Republican Party, all sorts of things like that. But before we do, we have listeners of this show around the country, around the world, who might not be familiar with kind of the ins and outs of Pennsylvania politics. So you served Pennsylvania's 15th district for 13 years, if I did my math correctly.
Almost 14.
Almost 14. So for folks, again, who are not from Pennsylvania, can you give us an overview of the district that you served and why you are no longer serving that district?
Yeah, I represented a district in eastern Pennsylvania, largely the Lehigh Valley, from my first 4 terms, and for my last 3 terms, the district included parts of south central Pennsylvania, went out as far as Hershey and southern Dauphin counties. So it was a wonderful district to represent. It was what we'd call a swing or marginal district, had a pretty good mix of urban, suburban, and rural communities. And so it was, in many respects, a bit of a bellwether for the country in terms of how it perform from an election standpoint.
Great. And so you served, as you said, for almost 14 years. What led to your decision to step away from office?
I had been contemplating, my next step probably since 2013. And for a variety of reasons, I just decided that the time was right for me. And I didn't say it prior to the election because I didn't want my House Republican colleagues to be too upset with me, but I know enough about politics to know that if you're in the party of the president, your party will take significant losses. And I anticipated early on that we House Republicans would be in the minority in the new session of Congress that they're in now. I would also say the current administration, was also a factor, just dealing with a never-ending drama and chaos. Was also a contributing factor.
You've said that the problems in Congress, kind of this perception that it's difficult to get anything done, as you just said, some of the chaos started before Donald Trump took office. Yeah. And, you served in the House for more than a decade under 3 different administrations. How did things change during that time? Did you start to see the seeds of some of these things take root over that time? Yeah,
I did. What I found, there used to be a rule, and I thought an understanding. It wasn't a rule, but it was a guideline. But there was a sense that members of a legislative body who represented what I would consider to be relatively safe seats, were expected to put up difficult governing votes pretty much all the time, and that changed during my time in Congress, where I learned that many of these members in these safe seats became increasingly concerned about potential primaries, and they found it very difficult to govern. And what I also noticed, too, there was also an expectation back then that members in these swing districts or marginal districts from time to time would be given a pass, so to speak, that they wouldn't be expected to put up votes on some of these difficult issues because they were in a greater risk of electoral defeat. But what's changed is these members in these swing and marginal districts end up putting up all the difficult governing votes all the time, and many of these members in these pretty safe seats, took a pass whenever they wanted. And so there was a kind of a breakdown in the traditional order or discipline of things in a legislative body. So I've noticed that was a big problem. And then that problem got magnified after the Republican takeover in 2010. After that election in the House, and then a few years into it, with the advent of the Freedom Caucus, it made things even more interesting.
Yeah. So now that you've had some time away, are there things that you wish you would have done differently, or things that you might have done differently to kind of sound the alarm about some of these things, or maybe have different conversations with your colleagues, or to the extent that you could use your influence to impact some of these issues?
I don't know there's anything I could have done to change it. I mean, I certainly raised the alarm. I raised my voice about it on many occasions. I don't know. There's much more I could have done. I mean, I think about that quite a bit. I mean, I think these trends are trends. It's kind of like the herd is moving in a direction. It's hard to change the direction of the herd. When the tide is receding or coming up, it's there's not a lot you can always do about that. You just have to figure out how to manage it.
Yeah. And so do you see, as you've said, there is kind of this increasing polarization is how we tend to think about it in kind of academic terms, but you described it as, politicians increasingly playing to their bases, et cetera. So do you think that the better path forward is to kind of accept that and go with it, or to try to change things to go back to maybe the way that they were before this kind of polarization was as severe as it is now?
Well, I don't know that you can ever really return to where you were, but we can get to a better place. And so what I mean by that is that, with the tribalization, the tribalism, the polarization, they're reaching a point that has brought about this, what seems to be a political paralysis. And so I guess the question is, how do we get to that better place? The tribal nature of politics. I mean, I feel like we have two political parties in this country now. One's a pro-Trump party and one's an anti-Trump party. I mean, what do they stand for? The Republican Party prior to Donald Trump, always had these I always said we had these, what I would call these self-designated chiefs of the purity police, who said this is what you need to stand for to be a good Republican. And if you didn't meet these litmus test issues on, or on taxes or free trade or abortion or LGBT or firearms, whatever the issue was, if you were somehow deviating from any of those policies or principles, you were considered a squish or a rhino. So I got that accusation. So then, okay, that was so this was about, ideology or, being doctrinaire. And now here comes Donald Trump, who he's a lot of things, but I can tell you what he is not. He is not doctrinaire, and he is not an ideologue. And so he's very transactional in nature. And so what I've always felt is with Donald Trump is that, the party now has shifted from one being about, very, rigid in terms of being doctrinaire and ideological. Now it's about loyalty to a man.
Yeah.
And that's what's changed. And so, issues like, free trade was a core principle for many Republicans. Now all of a sudden we have the most protectionist president we've seen in maybe a lifetime, certainly my lifetime. And, arguably, Smoot Hawley, Hoover signed that reluctantly. I mean, I don't think he wanted to sign it. So the point is the most protectionist president in my memory, at least since this more modern era. And so that's changed. And the Democratic Party, at the same time, is also trying to figure out what it stands for or against. It's also because of Donald Trump, I think, taking on a reflexively anti-Trump position. And in many respects has also shifted hard left on many issues, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, all these programs that they're talking about. I mean, listen to Elizabeth Warren every day, and she's got a proposal a minute, and they all cost a lot of money. I mean, it's easy it's not hard to think up of a proposal or a plan if money's not an obstacle in your own mind.
So, do you feel like you still have a place in the kind of pro-Trump Republican Party, or kind of the party more broadly?
At the moment, no, there's not a lot of room for a guy like me, but these moments are fleeting, and believe me, we are planning for the day when things change, and they will change inevitably. I mean, I thought the 2018 midterm would have been a wake-up call for some people. Apparently not. Apparently not. So. But, we'll see. We're going to have another election in 2020, and we'll see where the chips fall. But, I would say, too, in Pennsylvania and throughout the country, Republicans really saw significant drop-offs in suburban voters, particularly suburban women, and particularly suburban women with a college education. And I felt that, you look at, say, Chester County, Pennsylvania, I mean, it was just a complete, total disaster for Republicans, where 25% of Republicans who voted in that midterm election were voting against Republican candidates because of Donald Trump. And I would say that to some of my colleagues. What part of this don't we understand? There are many Republican members of Congress, who are appalled and horrified by the president's behavior and conduct in office. Privately. Publicly, they have to be careful because they all live in mortal fear of primaries, and they're afraid they'll lose their primary if they are at all critical in any significant way of the president publicly.
So is your sense then that folks are just kind of waiting and hold your breath and make plans for whatever happens post Donald Trump, whenever that might be?
I think that's true. Although, again, if you're a member of Congress in a swing or marginal district, you simply can't be labeled as a generic Republican or a generic Democrat. You have to develop your own brand. And that was always my advice to my colleagues. It's not going to do a Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County any good, or Connor Lamb in Allegheny County any good to be identified as generic Republican or generic Democrat, respectively. There's no point for that. You don't survive that way in those types of districts. And there are other districts like that around the country, so they have to be able to sell themselves and distinguish themselves and perhaps separate themselves from certain people in their own party. So I think that's something that we should talk about, is that you can't always be seen as a rubber stamp. Because even people who supported Donald Trump said, "Yeah, I voted for him, but I think he's a little off the wall. He's crazy at times, and you gotta still keep him in line." They don't expect people like that. They don't expect their congressman to be a rubber stamp for the executive. They expect there to be a little bit of distance. That you're there to represent this district, and there may be times you disagree, and that's okay. They expect you to do that.
Yeah, and let's talk about that sense of disagreement and checks and balances. I think we tend to think about congressional oversight here in the annals of academia at a very high level. We think about the framers and we think about what's in the Constitution in terms of checks and balances, but wondering what that actually looks like on the ground day to day. Was it something that you thought about a lot, or what role did that play in your service?
I think in some respects, oversight, is a serious responsibility of Congress, and it's done on a daily basis. I was on the Homeland Security and Transportation and Infrastructure committees prior to coming to the Appropriations Committee. And when I was on the Homeland Security Committee, we spent a lot of our time, really looking at what the department was doing. At that time, it was a relatively new department, very new department, and so there were growing pains. And so we exercised a lot of oversight, and a lot of it wasn't particular. Some of it wasn't, very glamorous or sexy, but it was necessary. But I find now that, the oversight seems to be more about, in many respects, getting your name on television, big high splash moments, as opposed to the hard, mundane work of, analyzing what these departments are doing, how they're spending money, and then going to the Appropriations Committee. I spent a lot of my time looking at where they were parking money, what they were doing with it, and saying, okay, we don't need to keep money in that account. We could move it out of there and move it elsewhere, or whatever. And this is just not necessarily that glamorous or interesting work, but that's the hard work of oversight. A lot of it is unseen by the public, but necessary. But much of the oversight that we talk about now, it's impeachment not impeachment proceedings, but the Russia investigation and all the oversight of the president's daily tweets or whatever the latest news flash is, instead of just the hard day to day.
So we have seen, though, several members of the Trump administration ignoring congressional subpoenas over the past couple of weeks as we record here. As someone who has been in these committees and part of these requests, what's lost when people don't comply with these requests?
Well, it's funny. I was a chairman of the House Ethics Committee at one time, and I had authorized subpoenas and issued subpoenas, but quite often. Just the threat of the subpoena. When we would authorize them, we didn't necessarily issue. They helped us in our negotiations to get somebody to come in voluntarily. If you don't come in voluntarily, you will be subpoenaed. And they don't want to be subpoenaed; that gets public. And so I guess now I think when error that Congressman Jerry Nadler, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, has made is I think they've I think they have just not been very strategic in terms of issuing subpoenas. When they issue subpoenas, everybody under the sun, all of a sudden it doesn't look like a serious oversight effort. It's just about politics at that point. And I think the Democrats would be well served to be much more strategic in determining who they want to come in and why. When everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And I think that's where the Democrats are right now. Now, that said, it is very problematic when this administration, is essentially going to willfully oppose or obstruct any subpoena for anyone. That's concerning. Although, to be fair, I've seen every presidential administration, Obama and Bush, look, they're always going to fight with you over subpoenas. But at the end of the day, they don't like them, but they'll negotiate something and there'll be some level of compliance. But with Donald Trump, he's just kind of taking the position, we're not honoring them. That will certainly undermine Congress's authority.
So, I think in some ways to bring this back to the founders, they didn't anticipate this increased emphasis on preserving a partisan identity over the power of the institution. What do you make of that, and what's the path forward there?
Got it, Jenna. Here's the deal. I believe in many respects we no longer have a system of separation of powers, but a system of separation of parties. And what I mean by that is I've noticed this, and this is not about Donald Trump. This predates Donald Trump. I've seen it with both political parties. It seems that the party controls whichever party controls the presidency, the Obama and the Democrats, their congressional party, the congressional Democrats see their obligation, and same with congressional Republicans, is to protect their president of that party, and so they will do things that you think would fly in the face of what maybe Madison had intended. Which is that you defend your institutional interests, and I think that has been a big problem. Again, it's about separation of parties more than separation of powers, and I have complained too, as I talked previously about this issue of declaring emergency on the border and taking appropriated funds for a purpose that it was not intended for. Now, to me, that is a clear institutional violation of Congress's authorities. I mean, that's why I felt that Republicans and Democrats alike should say, no, Mr. President, this is our bailiwick. We appropriated these monies for a specific purpose. You cannot move that money without a vote of the U.S. Congress. I mean, that's, regardless of, whether or not you agree with the president on the policy, I mean, that's where I think has gotten lost. That many members really do see their role is to protect the president of their party, separation of parties. And so they're behaving in many respects as if they're operating in a parliamentary system rather than this system of separation of powers and checks and balances that we know. I mean, this is not a parliamentary system. The executive is not part of the legislative body, the parliament, as in the UK, where Theresa May, she is part of the House of Commons and has a vote. That's not the case here, and I worry about that. We simply can't function like a parliamentary system, and I think at times many members feel like they're in a parliamentary system. In fact, a funny story about this: I was in India, and a very glib and articulate, very thoughtful Indian parliamentarian said in a gathering I was at, he said, the American system, your democratic system is brilliant. He said it would work wonderfully over here in India. He said, in fact, it would work better here than it's working in your own country.
Yeah. So, I mean, given all of that, I mean, where do we go from here? I mean, do you see that this trend will continue, or do you think that we might get back to a place where partisanship won't have such a large role in the governing process?
I guess the best I can say about that is that until voters insist on change, things won't these things won't change. Give the example of you hear a lot. I talk a lot about pragmatism. You've got to in order to get things done, we have to have people who are pragmatic. You can be ideologically or philosophically conservative or liberal or progressive, and that's fine, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, what I worry about, do they have the capacity to be pragmatic? There are very conservative and very liberal people who are pragmatic. Who will say, okay, yeah, I understand that you and I may disagree on these on several things, but there are two things we agree on, and so let's agree on those two things, set aside the stuff we disagree on, and move forward. But I think we're losing that ability in this system. If I'm for it, you must be against it. No matter what it is. It's gotten to the point of the absurd.
Yeah. So as we come up to the next round of elections here in 2020, what should voters be looking for? What questions can they ask candidates to kind of get at some of this? How committed they are to that hard work of governance, how pragmatic they are, some of these things that you've just been talking about.
What should voters do? Look, until voters are going to reward candidates who seek consensus and compromise and are pragmatic, then I don't think things will change. But if I think a lot of you look at the Congress today, particularly the House. There are a lot of members of the House. Who I think do a very good job of representing their bases, and in some cases, fringe elements of their bases. So and I think where there's a problem is that the political center of the country feels woefully underrepresented in the U.S. Congress right now. Now, I do think that the political center, I'm going to say somewhere between center right and center left, probably constitutes more than a majority of this country. I'd say probably a strong majority of this country. I bet 60% of the people in this country identify somewhere between those, in that range of center right to center left. And only about maybe 40%, 20 about that are, really, hardcore progressive, hardcore conservative. So I think until that 60% of the population is able to, speak with a louder voice, particularly in the primary process, which I think really is the root of many of our problems. It's the way we nominate candidates, not the way we elect them. It's the way we nominate them that I think contributes so much to this polarization. Look at the Democratic presidential primary now. Who can outflank the other? They're all trying to move hard left, and now I think Biden has figured out that maybe that's not the path forward. If you have a few dozen candidates, a few dozen candidates for president, they're all trying to go hard left. Well, maybe there is a center lane there, and maybe Biden can capture that if he can. And by the way, he was never considered the most centrist guy in the world. He was kind of considered pretty liberal. But in this day and age, he's really quite the moderate, of the race. So that just speaks to the issue of how these primaries, really drag these candidates to a place where most of them know they shouldn't go. Really, I think it's going to a terrible place, and I think the same thing happened on the Republican side in 2016. Many found themselves going to a bad place, and so how do you maybe there'll be a serious independent candidacy at some point. If the Democrats do nominate somebody on the hard left and the Republicans to stay, Trumpian, that's going to open that center lane for someone. Because major political parties, not just, and we tend to, in the United States, tend to be too focused on what's happening here, very American-centric, when in fact, you look at the two major political parties in Germany, the CDU, which is the Christian Democrats center-right, Social Democrats center-left. In the last election for chancellor, those two major parties, between the two of them, received 53% of the vote, barely a majority. You look at the United Kingdom, and their politics are completely scrambled as they are here over Brexit, where the Tories and Labour are both in a very bad spot. The politics there, it's really are you for stay or remain? That's the politics now, and it's people in both parties. In France, the two major political parties collapsed, and this fellow Emmanuel Macron, came up the middle. You look throughout Italy with a five-star movement. Hungary's got Orban, and Poland's kind of taken a more of a hard turn, a populist turn. And so we're seeing this. You saw it in France with Le Pen. You see it in the Netherlands with the Wilders. There's a populist uprising. Some use the term nationalistic. Nationalism in and of itself is not a bad thing. Nativism is, and I think we're seeing this. And a lot of the politics are driven by migration. And I think culture's changing faster than native populations can accept. And so, that's a conversation that probably needs to occur, in many democracies. We're all for immigration. The question is, how much and how fast, and I think that's really a core issue that's driving much of the turbulence.
Going back to that conflict that we were talking about earlier with Republicans who privately oppose President Trump but feel that they can't say so publicly because they're concerned about their own seat or job security, those kind of things. How would they respond, or what should they say to people who might say to them, well, isn't that kind of an abandonment of your duty to uphold the office and uphold your oath to serve, those sorts of things?
Well, I think it's hardly shocking that politicians will do what's in their political interest. They do that. It's like, fish swim in water. Politicians protect their interests. And I think you could ask that same question to Democrats. If the issue is, yes, the president's, in my view, the president's behavior has been quite, it's been horrible in many ways, deplorable. The way he carries on at times. But at the same time, many people elected him knowing that he carried on in bad ways and in ways that they themselves found objectionable, but still voted for him. So, so I can look back, and so at least as it relates to the question of impeachment, narcissism is not an impeachable offense. It's not at least I don't think it is. And I think there's an argument to be made. Yes, okay, you can be appalled by the guy's conduct, but there is a way to remedy that. It's through an election, and at that point, people will be able to express their pleasure or displeasure, with the state of the country. So, in many respects, if you're a Democrat and if you want Trump gone, I would think it'd be more satisfying for them to defeat him in an election than to have a vote of impeachment in the House only to watch it fail in the Senate. So I think they would be much more satisfied with that. And again, I think more people in Washington are focused on this, this whole Mueller, Barr, flap and investigation and impeachment. That is more of a Washington-based conversation. I think most Americans are focused on other things. They're worried about, health care or trade policy. Farmers are worried, disaster. They're focused on things that have immediate impact. And so I think we got to, I think in the bubble of Washington, D.C., they're focusing on a lot of it, focusing, excessively on Mueller, but that's much of the country has moved on. They've kind of made their minds up. I don't think there's any changing them.
Well, Charlie, this has been a fascinating conversation. We could easily talk about any one of these issues all day long, and maybe we'll have you back sometime to pick up on some of these things. But for now, we're going to end with our 4 Mood of the Nation poll questions. So thinking about politics and what's happening today, what makes you angry?
What makes me angry? I guess what makes me angry is the tribalization of the politics. It doesn't, the policy doesn't really matter that much as much as it used to. That's what I've said. These campaigns, they're policy-free zones. When Donald Trump ran, there really weren't many policies that he talked about. He talked about his poll numbers. He talked about himself. He talked about a lot of things, but he really didn't talk about policy. And I watch the Democrats, like a guy like Beto O'Rourke. It's all personality, charisma, not a lot of there. The only candidate who seems to be putting a lot of policy out there is Elizabeth Warren. And frankly, in my view, not a lot of it's that good, and it's very expensive. I guess that makes me angry is that we've become so tribal that where policy doesn't really make much of a difference at the moment.
Now, what makes you proud?
What makes me proud is that our system, with all its warts and with all its problems, is still remarkably strong and resilient, and that we do have wonderful institutions that maybe change over time, but are embedded, and that's a good thing. You watch, people talk about some of these fledgling democracies backsliding, and there are real worries about autocratic tendencies in some of these countries. But here, I don't worry about it because we have not only do we have we have a democracy, but we have the prerequisites and the foundations of a democracy: a free press, independent judiciary. We have separation of powers. We still have enough here that it's very strong, very robust. And while they might be taking a bit of a beating right now and might be a little bit battered, they'll emerge. They'll emerge still strong.
What makes you worry?
What makes me worry? What makes me worry is that the country has really significant challenges in front of us, and they go unaddressed or ignored as we deal with all the other noise. That someday we're going to have to deal with our long-term debt challenges. We need to deal with infrastructure, and because we cannot, as a country, get out of our own way, it seems, we just can't really deal with the very basics of governance. Just keeping the lights on. You have to deal with a debt ceiling.
And then finally, what gives you hope?
The American people are, by and large, very practical. This is a can-do country. I've always felt like this nation is the point of the spear. The people of this country are innovative. They're imaginative. A lot of ideas come out of this country. I mean, it's no accident that a lot of industries are born here. And then, and we spend a hell of a lot of time in this country talking about what we've lost. Sometimes we don't talk enough about what we've produced or what we've gained. Being the point of the spear, I tell these young people, I said, you don't have to tell me today what you're going to do with the rest of your life, because the jobs you're going to be working in don't exist yet. The fields that you're going to be working in don't exist yet. So, the issue then is to be adaptable, and that's the great thing about this country. People are practical, they are adaptable. They're a lot less afraid of change here than in most places of the world, and so it's not surprising that this is where so much of global innovation occurs. That doesn't mean it's always going to be that way, or that we have to maintain our edge, but that's the real hope for this country, and so we have I think a better ability to look forward than most people. Even though it seems at times we look back and we moan about what was, but it's the future that's usually bright for us.
Great. Well, that's a great place to leave things. Charlie Dent, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Jenna. Thanks for having me on the show.
Okay, well, we're back, and thank you, Jenna. That was a really interesting interview. He's quite thoughtful and insightful.
And really appreciate the fact that he's just, saying what he thinks is going on.
Yeah, he had a great phrase that does go back to what we were talking about before the interview, where he said we're now rather than a separation of powers, we now have a separation of parties.
Right. And how that almost necessitates the kind of gridlock you were talking about as well.
Yeah. So I was focusing on the notion that the parties are so competitive now. And, it's a tradition of many great political scientists over the years that the key characteristic of a party system is always the level of competition.
Yeah.
Competitive party systems are different than non-competitive party systems. But his perspective on it is a little different. He wasn't talking about that. Rather, he was emphasizing, and this too I think is quite important, the role of polarization.
Right. When you have a two-party system, and when those two parties are roughly equal in terms of power and in terms of their standing in the electorate, this kind of polarization becomes all the more.
Well, I actually think the polarization comes from a different sort of phenomenon, and that's a sorting of people that's taken place really since the mid-1960s, where as the South, which is the most conservative region in the country, moved out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party, and that had a powerful effect on the Republican Party in terms of
and on the Democratic
to
Party
the right,
too.
on the Democratic Party. And what you've seen over time is a sort of sorting where people that see themselves as liberal and with social identities that that tend to be more liberal have moved into the Democratic Party, and the opposite has happened in terms of the Republican Party. So you have more ideologically pure parties. I mean, not as pure as you're obviously going to get in a multi-party system, but parties that are more ideologically coherent.
He says that, he argues that the extreme of the American electorate is running the show for both parties.
Right.
So it's like 10, maybe 15, 20% at most of on both sides are the ones who are determining policy and determining candidates. And so this big middle that he claims to represent and to be, a part of himself, is just kind of shut out. And so compromise becomes impossible. Compromise is a dirty word.
Right, because if you have a district that the Democrat's going to win,
right,
or one where the Republican's going to win, then the primary becomes most critical. And primaries are fought only among members of a single political party.
And so the people who come out for those elections are the ones who are most identified, most strident, most single issue.
Right, which is why most of the Democratic candidates for president are staking out positions pretty far to the left, because that's where they see the primary electorate as largely being.
That's how they win.
Yeah,
and that's how they keep their job once they've got it.
Yeah, so he does see that as important, and he also pointed out to us, I thought effectively, that we shouldn't expect more of politicians than we're getting.
I agree with that.
So let's close on one last point that he made that I think is really important in terms of understanding that Congress still does some of the hard work of democracy. And that is when he talked about oversight. Because, the point he was making is that all this focus on the Democrats issuing of subpoenas and investigations under the name of oversight is how kind of I understood what he was saying. It sort of distorts our understanding of what oversight really is.
It's just too narrow.
It's too narrow, yeah.
Well, I mean, that because it's Article 1, because Congress makes a law, because Congress has the power of the purse.
And because the entire executive branch is created by the Congress.
Right. And because it is more directly connected to the sovereignty of the people, it has a more important role. I mean, that's the way it was meant to be.
Right. And he's making the point that this goes on, but we don't really see it because it's not that exciting and it's not that interesting.
A lot of it, that's true.
But the work of oversight is for the most part kind of boring and routine. But to just step back a minute as to where it comes from, when I say that Congress created the executive branch, of course the executive branch is in Article 2 of the Constitution, but it really gives it very little. And it's Congress that comes in and, for example, says, we're going to create a Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security is going to have the powers to do this.
Right.
And it's going to be set up like this. And then it's the president's job to execute the laws that are set up, for example, for the Department of Homeland Security. But Congress created that. And so the oversight comes from their responsibility to make sure that the executive branch is functioning as they set it up to function.
Right.
And that's what the hard work of oversight really is, and it's critical to a democracy.
And the one example that
because the president's not a king and cannot just do whatever they want to do in the executive branch.
And so the one example he pointed to was the president's desire to change the budgeting in the military to bring in money to pay for his wall. And Charlie Dent said, leave aside, bracket the question of whether that's a good idea.
Yeah.
This is a problem for our constitutional frame of government, and it has to be blocked if we're going to continue it.
Right, and we should also recognize that, in a case like that, many Republicans did step forward and say this really is stepping into legislative powers, and you shouldn't be, because they recognize, the more you enlarge the powers of the executive branch in any given administration, well, that carries over to the next administration.
Right. And sooner or later, the shoe's going to be on the other foot.
Exactly.
And that is probably one of the things that one of the few things that still remains as a brake on executive action and on congressional action is that, sooner or later, this is going to be the other ox that's getting gored, and we're going to be sorry we gave them this power.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But it's also good for people to recognize the role of someone who's open to both sides, open to compromise. And his takeaway is, if you want that, you're going to have to vote for it, because you're not going to see that kind of change on, there's no profiles in courage here.
Yep.
It's if you want it different, go make it different.
Yep. I mean, it was interesting to hear him also, because he's no liberal. I mean, he's a conservative. No. His comments about Elizabeth Warren in particular really, show that when it comes to the role of government, he is for a smaller government and one that does less and spends less. But still, there's a non-ideological character to the way he talks
pragmatic,
about Congress, and pragmatic that I think we're really missing.
Yeah,
right
I
now.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Jenna and to Charlie. I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Michael Berkman.
Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is produced by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Penn State. Our hosts are Michael Berkman, Chris Beam, and me, Jenna Spinelli. Andy Grant is our engineer, and Mark Stitzer is our editor. Additional support comes from Emily Reddy, Shireen Stanford, Craig Johnson, and the rest of the team at WPSU. For detailed show notes and discussion questions for each episode, visit our website at democracyworkspodcast.com. And if you like what you heard today, please consider rating or reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.